Barack Obama, the premier orator of our modern political era, a man who transformed simple pauses into sermon-like moments and brief statements into iconic campaign slogans, found himself in a setting where his established charisma no longer commanded the atmosphere. He entered the hearing displaying the posture of an expert who thoroughly understood how to navigate rooms, leverage cameras, manage silence, and use a thoughtful tilt of the head to disarm accusations before they were even fully articulated. This environment was not unfamiliar, nor was it hostile in the conventional sense, as Obama had built his career around rendering aggressive spaces feeling unreasonable for questioning his vision. Yet the true threat present in that room was not vocal heckling or a shallow media ambush. It was composed of paper, dates, figures, and internal memoranda, the cold, objective instruments that are entirely indifferent to the beauty of a man's delivery. Even before the initial argument fully landed, the nature of the entire confrontation was clearly defined. One individual arrived with eloquent language, while the other arrived with substantiated records. Obama began, as he always did, by attempting to elevate himself above the noise, the perceived pettiness, and the partisan conflict. He positioned himself not just within the hearing, but above it, acting as if the chamber required a reminder that political discourse could remain noble when channeled through the right voice. He leaned back with the relaxed ease of a gracious dinner host, one hand placed near the table while the other remained loose, signaling comfort, authority, and years of seasoned experience as if every microphone present had been awaiting his specific arrival. His voice was low, smooth, and deliberately tempered. It was not loud, yet it possessed the kind of resonance cultivated over decades, designed to reach the back of the room without appearing to exert any effort. It was the specific tone that caused journalists to lean forward by pure reflex, a habit ingrained by long exposure to his style. He spoke regarding their collective purpose, the reasons public servants enter politics, and the shared values both parties theoretically hold beneath the performative combat, wrapping the entire room in traditional civic rhetoric before anyone could force him into granular details. He argued that government acts as a force for good, asserting this was an American principle rather than a partisan one. Even the word American seemed to arrive polished and buffered, delivered with sufficient cadence to make any disagreement appear subtly indecent. Then followed his signature practiced humility, a form of confession that frequently functions as protective armor. Obama understood that acknowledging minor imperfections early makes subsequent accusations sound less like substantive evidence and more like tedious repetition. He stated that he had navigated his career imperfectly, as all human beings do, and he paused after the word imperfectly just long enough for the room to acknowledge his apparent self-awareness before anyone could challenge the actual consequences of those imperfections. It was a classic Obama pause, not vacant, accidental, or nervous, but architectural. The pause was structured like a doorway, inviting the audience to engage with him before the core argument even commenced. A reporter in the second row leaned in only slightly, yet it was enough to confirm that the old rhythm still held muscle memory within the press corps. Obama concluded by remarking that an honest accounting of successes and failures was essential to democracy, stating he welcomed the conversation, which sounded magnanimous until the reality of that conversation finally materialized. JD Vance had remained largely stationary while Obama spoke, and that stillness became increasingly significant with every passing sentence. In a room accustomed to following Obama's cadence, Vance appeared to be the single individual refusing to be conducted. His sleeves were rolled up, his glasses rested low on his nose, and a stack of documents waited before him with the blunt patience of evidence that required no charisma to withstand cross-examination. He sat with both hands resting flat on the table, not fidgeting or decorating the moment with unnecessary performance. When he finally addressed the room, his voice was quiet enough that the microphone required intense focus to capture his words. He addressed the former president by stating he wanted to share something unexpected, and the sentence, while not overtly dramatic, shifted the room because it did not sound like the start of an assault. He looked directly at Obama rather than the camera, the chairman, or his notes. That directness carried its own weight in a city where individuals often avoid eye contact with those they intend to challenge. He stated that he had voted for Obama in 2008, And for a fleeting instant, Obama's face betrayed the flicker of a man encountering a line for which he had not prepared a response. It was not shock or fear, but his chin rose slightly and his eyebrows shifted just enough for the front row cameras to register the reaction. Vance did not allow the sentence to dissolve into sentimentality, as he knew that would have simply allowed Obama to frame the exchange around shared civic optimism. Vance was not present to swap memories. He spoke of being a youth from Middletown, Ohio, raised by a mother struggling with addiction and a grandmother who managed a household on meager wages in a place defined by stained carpets and broken doors. The room fell silent because this biography was not being used as emotional decoration but as legal jurisdiction. Vance recalled Obama standing in Grant Park promising hope and change, and he admitted he had believed him, not with irony, but with the genuine conviction of a young man from an overlooked town who finally felt recognized. He explained that people in Middletown had believed as well, including those who had long ago abandoned the political machinery and viewed the system as something done to them by elites who would never experience the consequences. Obama had brought them back, Vance admitted, and that admission was more cutting than any insult because it negated the easy defense that this was merely partisan hostility. He credited that movement to words, and then his hand moved to the stack of papers with a restraint that highlighted the motion more effectively than a forceful strike against the table. He stated he was present because of those very words. He opened the first page, and the hearing immediately shifted in tone because documents possess a different gravity than rhetoric, and every person in that room understood the distinction. On June 15, 2009, Vance read, giving the date significant weight before delivering the quote, "As dates are the tools that convert memory into evidence." He then quoted Obama's promise that if individuals liked their doctor or health care plan, they could keep them. He did not mock the president's voice or caricature the rhythm, but he borrowed just enough of the spacing to make the words resonate as they had when they were originally sold to the country. He lowered the page and his voice returned to a flat, unvarnished tone, the voice of a man reading a final bill. 5 million Americans received cancellation notices, Vance stated, and the room had no immediate rebuttal because such a massive number is not merely emotional when placed beside a specific promise. He noted that PolitiFact, not a partisan organization but a widely recognized arbiter, had named that promise the lie of the year in 2013. The point was not subtle, as subtlety would have been wasted. The accusation was not that healthcare policy is complex or that reform inevitably has winners and losers. Every professional excuse in Washington relies on moving audiences from concrete reality to abstract concepts. Vance refused to follow that pattern. He kept the room focused on the specific sentences people heard and the notices they actually received. He set the page down, retrieved the next, and the ritual began to reveal itself. By the second page, the pattern was evident. Vance would read a promise in a borrowed public rhythm, then strip away the performance to answer it with the historical record, the specific date, and the real-world consequence. On January 21, 2009, he read, noting Obama's first day in office when he pledged his would be the most transparent administration in history. That line had once sounded like a moral cleansing, a declaration that Washington's shadows would be exposed by sheer confidence. Vance responded in his own voice, noting the administration prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous administrations combined. He did not rush the final phrase, allowing time for the accusation to settle. He detailed how the Department of Justice secretly seized phone records from the Associated Press and how the FBI labeled a Fox News reporter a criminal co-conspirator for conducting standard journalistic inquiry. A journalist in the press row stopped typing, her hand suspended between instinct and embarrassment, as the statement walked directly into the memory of her own profession. It was a filthy mirror Vance held up, and he did not pause for the room to recover, as recovery is where political spin begins. In February 2009, he read, Obama promised he would not rest until every American who desired a job could find one. Those words had once sounded muscular and compassionate, promising labor, dignity, and a president who would exhaust himself on behalf of the forgotten. Vance brought the promise back to Middletown, to the Armco steel plant where his grandmother had worked and where half the town had earned a living. a place where a high school graduate could start a job with benefits on a Monday. He noted the plant closed its final production line during Obama's presidency, and the statement functioned as an obituary for the local industry. He added that opioid prescriptions in Butler County tripled between 2009 and 2015, making the decline physical rather than theoretical. The jobs departed and the pills arrived, he stated, traveling the same roads and entering the same houses, as if the supply chain of despair had replaced the supply chain of labor. That was a line a polished speechwriter would have avoided for being too blunt and regional, but Vance did not avoid it because he was not seeking to flatter the room with abstraction. He was forcing the room to look directly at the wreckage lying beneath its own polished exterior. "You did not rest, Mr. President," he stated. "You delivered beautiful speeches." He did not wait for the audience to decide if the line was sarcastic or mournful, as the distinction mattered little in such a setting. The speeches were undeniably beautiful, but that beauty was the very problem when it served as a curtain to obscure the sinking floorboards. Vance turned the next page with controlled motion, lacking flourish or raised volume as the documents were performing the labor for him. In March 2009, he read, "Obama promised that ignoring the law when inconvenient was not who they were as a nation." That line once made audiences nod, sounding less like policy and more like national purification. Vance contrasted it against the record of Operation Fast and Furious, stating the Justice Department deliberately permitted roughly 2,000 firearms to cross the Mexican border into the hands of cartels in hopes of tracking them, only to lose them. There was no need to embellish that sentence, as the facts were grotesque enough. One of those weapons was recovered at the scene where Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was killed on American soil. The room felt the shift that occurs when a scandal transcends procedure to become an unanswered question for a grieving mother. When Congress investigated, Attorney General Eric Holder refused to produce documents. Obama invoked executive privilege, and Congress held Holder in contempt in a bipartisan vote. Vance allowed the word bipartisan to linger, as it eliminated the standard escape route. This was not a partisan committee chasing headlines, but a dead federal agent, missing firearms, blocked records, and a mother who still lacked a full accounting of her son's death 14 years later. A man in the audience wearing a VFW cap pressed his hand into his knee until his knuckles whitened, remaining motionless as he refused to offer the room the satisfaction of witnessing his reaction. Vance turned the page, and the sound of the paper became an audible warning. In January 2009, he read, Obama made one of his easiest and most repeated vows. He would close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. For years, that line was presented as proof that the country under Obama would repair its image, acting as a marker of restoration and a return to lawfulness. Vance did not deliver a lecture on counterterrorism. He simply stated flatly, "It is open." Two words struck harder than a paragraph because they bridged the distance between a promise made in January and a facility still operating years later, a concrete footnote to moral branding. It was not that presidents do not face constraints, but that Obama's political gift was the ability to make those constraints disappear, making history seem as though it would bend on schedule if the right man held the microphone. Vance kept reminding the room that the microphone had not, by itself, moved anything. The next page turned toward ideology and evidence, referencing an early Obama claim that his administration would not base policy on ideology rather than evidence. That sentence had flattered admirers by placing him above crude tribalism, yet Vance countered with the IRS scandal where groups like the Tea Party Patriot and 9/12 were singled out for intrusive questioning and delays. The ugliness was not mere bureaucratic abuse, but the deployment of administrative machinery against outsiders while the administration floated in professorly detachment. Lois Lerner was called before Congress, Vance noted, and she invoked the Fifth Amendment. That sentence carried a specific stink, reminding the room how Washington accountability often works: statements for cameras, silence under oath, and retirement from consequences. She did not answer a single question, Vance stated, and the simplicity of that line made the entire episode feel smaller and dirtier. Obama's face remained composed, but composition was no longer control. It was becoming a position he was forced to hold. Vance was not yelling, which made the argument harder to interrupt, as outrage can be dismissed. But documentation sounds almost polite while stripping the paint from the walls. He held the final page of that sequence slightly longer, his thumb moving along the edge, a small human gesture that made the item feel heavier before he spoke. In September 2014, he read, and his voice dropped, not for sympathy, but because some facts worsen when spoken softly. Obama had declared that they do not leave their people behind, as that is who they are as Americans. Vance countered with the Phoenix VA scandal, where veterans died while waiting for medical care listed on secret waiting lists maintained to artificially shorten reported wait times. A federal audit revealed tens of thousands of veterans who had requested appointments never received them, with others waiting over 90 days for care promised as a debt of honor. Mama's neighbors went to that VA, Mr. President, Vance stated. Once again, the national scandal shrank to a town, a waiting room, and a man sitting under fluorescent lights while a government clipboard pretended time was shorter than it was. These were men who had served in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf, men who had been told sacrifice bought the dignity of being seen after the war. They waited for months while the hospital lied about their wait times, and the sentence carried that brutal bureaucratic absurdity America knows too well, the kind where the lie is not grand, just administrative enough to become evil. Vance set the page down, and the table now held a line of white rectangles against the dark wood, not random notes, but a physical timeline. 7 promises on one side, 7 realities on the other, stripping the political music away until only the noise remained. The row stretched toward the center, representing the distance between the rally and the cancellation notice, between the inaugural address and the subpoena. It marked the space between the moral declaration and the facility still operating, and between the promise to veterans and the secret list that hid their suffering. Vance looked at Obama and stated the country was promised hope while places like Middletown received heroin, and change while factories became empty shells with weeds pushing through parking lots. He noted Obama had promised not to rest, but Mama's neighbors were the ones who had not rested while waiting for the change the president traveled the country describing. It was harsh but focused, personal but not random. It was a prosecutor's case built from a forgotten town's disappointment. Obama leaned forward, and the posture change mattered as he ceased being the host and became a defendant. His body shifted toward the microphone, shoulders settling into a register of seriousness used for national tragedies and campaign nights where leaders sound wounded but in command. Mr. Vice President, I appreciate your candor and your personal story, he began, and the old rhythm attempted to return with its full machinery. He paused, and the room leaned, because that is what Obama's pauses did. They created gravity and trained the audience to believe the following sentence would organize the chaos. Then he stated that governing is hard, indeed the hardest thing there is. He argued that the gap between promise and policy is not a failure of character, but the width of democracy itself. It was a skilled answer if the charge had been mere disappointment, or if he had been accused of failing to complete a checklist while history, Congress, and crises pushed back. It was the response of a man who knew how to turn a broken promise into a lesson about institutions, making the gap between speech and results sound like the normal weather of democracy. Obama asserted that no president in history had delivered everything promised, not Lincoln, Roosevelt, Reagan, or himself. The repetition carried ascending pressure, each name placed like a column holding up a cathedral ceiling. The point was clear. Do not judge leadership by the narrow cruelty of isolated promises, but by the arc of direction. He spoke of justice, imperfection, compromise, and legislation, and for a moment the old Obama returned, not untouched, but still dangerous. He straightened his chair and put his record on the table. The only way a president can when failures cluster around a legacy. 20 million Americans gained health insurance, he asserted. The economy was rescued from a second Great Depression, and the Iran agreement prevented a nuclear weapon without a single American casualty. The sentences were designed to widen the lens, to make Vance's 7 pages appear selective, and to remind the room that presidencies are not small claims courts where each broken promise is judged in isolation. It was a disciplined, broad-frame defense, and there was nothing accidental about it, as Obama understood that numbers can be answered with larger numbers if the moral frame is shifted quickly enough. He stated he would put his record against any administration in modern history, and after that phrase, he paused for 3 full seconds, calibrated, and offered it like a verdict. A Democratic staffer behind the table sat straighter because that pause was the sound of a champion finding his stance again. A pen on the press row moved because the sentence gave the writers something familiar to write about, the elegant reframing and the rise from accusation to legacy. For half a breath, it seemed the room might follow him, as rooms had followed him for years, making resistance seem like an exhausting chore. Vance waited, not interrupting the rhythm or fighting the applause that did not arrive, waiting for the pens to stop. Then he stated, "Mr. President, 20 million Americans got insurance and 5 million more lost the plans you told them they could keep." The room shifted again because Vance had refused the invitation to debate legacy while the specific cancellation notice remained on the table. Obama had offered history. Vance dragged him back to the people history had stepped over. "You are counting the people you helped," he stated, picking up one of the pages with a movement so plain it felt almost cruel, "while I am reading the names of the people you lied to." The pen stopped. That was the sentence that cracked the broad-frame defense, as it did not deny the 20 million, nor did it make the amateur mistake of arguing that the other side's facts were false. It accepted the achievement and forced it to stand beside the deception, exactly where political myth hates to stand. Vance understood the weakness in Obama's answer. It was constructed to defend complexity, but the charge had narrowed itself to knowledge, choice, and wording. If Obama had merely overpromised, his defense might have sufficed. If he had been surprised by consequences, his philosophy might have held. But Vance was about to argue something worse than imperfection. "I want to read one more thing," Vance stated, and the room recognized the temperature drop before the object appeared. He reached beneath the stack, not from the top where the public promises waited, but from under it, and brought out a single page on different stock with a different header, a White House internal memorandum. It looked unlike campaign quotes or public speeches. It was the kind of document that arrives without need of dramatic lighting because the seal, the date, and the phrase internal communication perform the work. Vance stated it was dated September 12, 2013, 2 months before the healthcare.gov launch, sent by a senior policy advisor to the chief of staff. He adjusted his glasses, and the movement seemed to take longer than necessary. When he read, he did so at the speed of dictation, each clause separated cleanly, each phrase placed into the transcript as evidence. "The keep your plan language is going to be a problem," he read, and the sentence carried a bureaucratic blandness that exacerbated the situation because bureaucrats do not write that way unless a warning has passed through layers of politeness. HHS projections show between 5 and 8 million individual market policyholders will receive cancellation notices in the first 90 days, he read. He looked up after the number, not with triumph, but with cold precision. "Between 5 and 8 million, he repeated. That was not a Republican estimate or a conservative think tank number, but the figure Obama's own people had written down before the collapse of the public promise became impossible to deny. Vance read further, noting the document did not merely predict the problem, but proposed the honest repair, stating they needed to stop using the line or add a caveat. They advised that at minimum the president should say most people instead of everyone, because continuing the current language created significant legal and political exposure. There it was, the smallest possible truth, one caveat standing between political messaging and millions of Americans hearing a promise the administration's own projections had already undermined. Most people instead of everyone was not a demand for a national apology, but the kind of modest correction a decent communication team makes when reality intrudes on a slogan. The memo did not ask Obama to abandon the policy, it asked him to stop saying the part his own staff knew would not hold. Vance set that page down and picked up the response, a piece brutally short because the worst documents in politics are often the little ones that reveal the quiet part with professional efficiency. He read the chief of staff's reply, his voice dropping to the tone of a man who knows that raising it would grant permission to call the moment theater. Pushed reviewed, he read, "He wants to keep the line as is. It pulls at 78% favorability." Vance paused, then read the final sentence with enough stillness for every camera to capture the faces at the table. "If we caveat it, we lose the message. The hearing room ceased to behave like a hearing room. The overhead fluorescent light hummed, a thin electrical noise audible only because no one wanted to breathe too loudly. A pen rolled off a table on the press row and hit the carpet, a sound so small it was almost ridiculous, yet it traveled through the room because every larger sound had retreated. Vance set the page at the end of the row, the eighth white rectangle, the one that altered the meaning of all 7 preceding it. The earlier pages showed broken promises. This one suggested premeditation. "If we caveat it, we lose the message," Vance repeated. Same pace, same voice, not for drama, but for the stenographer and the public record that would persist after the cameras powered down. He stated Obama's own staff had warned him the promise was false, not hinted or wondered vaguely in a policy fog, but written in a memorandum with a seal and a specific number, 5 to 8 million cancellations. They had offered the alternative, the softest correction imaginable, say most people instead of everyone. One word, one caveat, one honest limit on a sentence that had been too useful to restrain. Vance removed his glasses and set them on the stack, and the gesture felt final. He stated Obama's response had not been to ask how to fix it or to admit they owed people the truth, but rather that the line tested well and should remain. That was the moment the hearing stopped being about ordinary political failure and became about choice, not a failure to foresee, but a refusal to caveat, a decision to retain the cleaner lie because the messier truth weakened the message. "You didn't misspeak, Mr. President," Vance stated, looking directly at Obama. "You didn't oversimplify a complicated policy." The room held still around those words as he cut away the escape routes one by one before Obama could utilize them. Vance asserted that Obama had been told in writing, in a document with a White House seal, that the promise was false, and he chose to keep making it because the lie tested better in a focus group. 5 million Americans lost their health insurance because the poll number mattered more than the caveat. There it was, stripped down, brutal, and impossible to soften without denying the memo's content. Obama's left hand moved below the table to his knee, away from the camera line, and his right hand adjusted his tie knot a quarter turn, barely visible but detectable. It was the first time that morning his physical composure had faltered, and with Obama that mattered, as he did not fidget unless his voice had started running out of ground. The adjustment was not vanity, but the tell of a man whose body searched for a task because stillness had become too difficult to maintain. Vance did not smile. He did not need to, because the table had already accomplished what raised voices usually fail to achieve. The 7 pages, the 8th memo, the dates, the quotes, the numbers, the cancellation notices, the dead agent, the veterans, the whistleblowers, the closed factory, the open prison, the row of white rectangles had become louder than any speech in the building. Vance remained seated, which mattered because he was not performing a courtroom finish or pacing for a jury. He remained exactly where he had been from the start, sleeves rolled, hands close to the documents, voice controlled, like a man who had come not to overpower Obama, but to force him to answer the part of politics speeches usually escape. He stated Obama was the greatest speaker of his generation, and the compliment sounded almost merciless because it amplified the indictment. "When you talk, people listen," Vance told him, and the room knew it was true because they had been doing exactly that for years. "When you pause, people wait," he continued, and the sentence landed because the hearing had already proven it with reporters leaning into the silence. "When you say the word hope, people believe it." That was the heart of the indictment, not merely that Obama had promised too much, but that the trust he summoned was precisely what made the broken promises so damaging. Vance did not deny the gift. He named it plainly, called it real, and then turned the gift back on the giver. He spoke of watching Obama's speeches with Mama on a television with a broken antenna, holding the device at a specific angle just to keep the picture alive. After one of those speeches, Vance said, Mama had looked at the screen and remarked, "That man talks so good it makes you forget to check if he is telling the truth." The line settled over the hearing like a verdict from a woman who never needed a fellowship, a think tank, or a Sunday show invitation to understand the oldest trick in politics. It was not polished, academic, or phrased for elite approval, which was why it cut deeper than any institutional critique could have. Vance stated he checked, and what he found was 7 promises, 7 dates, 7 lies, one staff memo warning the largest one was false, and one decision inside the White House to keep saying it because the line played well. He stated Obama had promised hope and Middletown received heroin, promised change and factories became parking lots, promised people they could keep their doctors and 5 million could not, promise transparency and prosecuted those who sought it, and promised no one would be left behind while veterans died waiting on hidden lists. Mama did not live to see the hearing, Vance stated, and the sentence carried different weight because it moved the confrontation out of Washington and back into the House where the belief had started. She had died in Middletown in a neighborhood Obama's speeches mentioned and his policies forgot. That line carried the kind of controlled contempt that requires no profanity because the accusation is already sharp enough. Before she died, she offered the only political advice he ever needed: watch what they do, not what they say. Vance picked up his glasses, folded them, and set them beside the memo, the small click of the hinges carrying through the room with strange finality. He stated he had watched what Obama did. Obama gave the greatest speeches in modern American politics and broke every promise inside them. That's all I have, Vance stated. It was the cleanest ending available, as anything more would have weakened what had already landed. The chairman asked whether President Obama wished to respond, and all eyes shifted back to the man who had built a public life out of never appearing cornered by language. Obama opened his mouth and began, "I appreciate," then paused in the same measured shape the room had heard all morning. It was the same length, the same breath, the same professional silence he had used thousands of times to make audiences lean forward and wait for the sentence that would organize the air. But this time, the woman in the second row did not lean. The man beside her did not lean, and neither did the staffer who had sat straighter during Obama's earlier defense. The room had spent the morning obeying Obama's silences by instinct, but this pause no longer pulled anyone toward it, because the bodies in the room understood before the minds were ready to admit it. A pause that holds an answer creates gravity. A pause that holds nothing leaves people exactly where they are. Obama tried again, stating he appreciated the vice president's remarks, then paused longer, his eyes moving to the middle distance where a sentence was supposed to appear. "I have always believed," he began, then stopped, and the tiny movement in his jaw looked like a man testing words and realizing they would not survive the room. He said public service, then stopped again, and the fragments were worse than silence because they showed the machinery failing in real time. This was a man who could speak for 45 minutes without notes, who could eulogize strangers and make the nation feel personally addressed, who could turn the English language into an instrument so precise that a single pause changed the temperature of a hall. Now the instrument would not play. He finally stated, "I stand by the work we did." 6 words from a man who had once built whole political identities out of paragraphs. Each word arrived with too much empty space around it, and the width of those spaces became the actual answer. The clip broke across the internet before the week was out because it was Obama, and because what people were watching was not merely a politician losing an argument. They were watching the greatest political speaker alive discover in public that eloquence has a border, and that border is a document with a date on it. The short version traveled fastest. Vance reading, "If we caveat it, we lose the message," then Obama's face during the pause that no longer held anything. The long version, from "I voted for you in 2008" to "That's all I have," became the kind of video people watched alone late at night because it asked a question more uncomfortable than any partisan slogan: did I believe him too? Afterward, the fallout moved exactly the way it moves in Washington, first through clips, then through statements, then through careful distance disguised as scheduling conflicts. House Oversight announced a formal inquiry into internal communications related to the Affordable Care Act messaging, and subpoenas followed for memoranda tied to the Keep Your Plan language during the critical months before the launch. Obama faced no legal jeopardy, but politics is not only law, and reputations do not need indictments to bleed. Three sitting Democrats declined to appear at an event where he was scheduled to speak, while a fourth attended but was photographed 4 seats away from the empty chair reserved for him. By evening, the empty chair had become its own image, its own quiet caption, its own brutal little metaphor. In Akron, Ohio, a man named James watched the version on a laptop balanced on his knee. He had voted for Obama in 2008, the first election he was old enough for, because hope had sounded clean before the fine print arrived. He had enlisted the next year, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and returned home with a compressed disc, a ringing ear, and a VA referral that was supposed to take 30 days. It took 14 months of hold music, voicemail, file reviews, and the humiliation of being told by a recorded voice that his call was very important. When Vance said veterans died on a waiting list, James looked at his hands and realized he had survived the waiting, but he was not sure he had survived the believing. At the Naval Observatory, Vance sat with a glass of water and a yellow legal pad and wrote 2 words in handwriting. Mama was right. He did not underline the words, as they did not need it, and he did not turn them into a speech, because some truths shrink when politicians dress them up. In a house on Martha's Vineyard, Obama sat in a study surrounded by books in front of a blank legal pad and did not write. He was a writer, a man who had always processed crisis by finding the sentence that made sense of it. But that night, the sentence did not come. The page stayed blank, and the blankness was the part no speech could repair. 7 promises, 7 dates, 1 memo, 1 sentence from inside his own White House. If we caveat it, we lose the message. He had not misspoken. He had chosen the poll number over the truth, and somebody had finally checked. Mama had said it years earlier in a living room in Middletown, watching a gifted man speak through a broken antenna. He talks so good it makes you forget to check if he is telling the truth.